Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. As expected, US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order that prevents American federal agencies from contracting or hiring foreign workers, especially those who are on H-1B visas. A few weeks back, in the month of June, Trump had suspended the issuance of temporary work visas, including the H-1B visa, till the end of this year. Now, his administration has brought in a new executive order that prevents American federal agencies from hiring foreign workers, especially those who are in the United States on H-1B visas. The president has stated that this decision has been taken in the interest of protecting American jobs, which according to him is being snatched away by cheap foreign labor, and this is in line with his America First policy. Donald Trump has justified that these decisions are necessary in order to protect American jobs, as the unemployment rate has risen exponentially due to the stagnation of the American economy, which has been further aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this context, let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which analyzes the impact of this conservative immigration policy of the Trump administration on Indian economic interests in the United States. See, this decision of Donald Trump is a continuation of the series of attacks that the Trump administration has unleashed against skilled foreign workers. Earlier in April, the Trump administration decided to suspend the issuance of green cards, which grants permanent residency or the PR status to immigrants. Then in June, the US government suspended the issuance of all temporary work visas, including the H-1B visa, till the end of this year. And now, the president has signed an executive order that prevents federal agencies from hiring foreign workers who are on H-1B visas. These decisions are a part of the conservative immigration policy that the Trump administration has adopted in an election year, and it is bound to significantly affect Indian interests in the United States, especially Indian economic interests. These curbs, which are being imposed on work visas, is bound to affect the Indian industry, which has significant stakes and investments in the US economy. It's also going to affect the Indian students and Indian professionals who rely upon such temporary visas to work in the United States by offering their high quality skill sets. This is also going to bring pressure on the government of India, which is bound to protect the interests of the Indian industry, the Indian students and Indian professionals. And this is likely to affect India's bilateral relationship with the United States, particularly in the economic domain. See, the American tech industry and the Indian IT and ITES industry are heavily dependent on the H-1B visas. This is a temporary work visa that allows the tech companies to bring in highly skilled foreign workers into the United States. And Indian professionals happen to be the largest beneficiaries of this visa program, because every year, nearly 60 to 70% of the H-1B visas that are granted by the US are allocated for Indians. The American tech industry and the Indian IT industry have relied upon the H-1B visa route to bring in cheap and skilled labor, and this has directly contributed to phenomenal growth in the American and Indian IT industry. The Indian IT industry, which contributes significantly to the American economy, feels that it is being unfairly targeted by the Trump administration, and it feels that accusations of stealing American jobs equates Indian professionals with illegal migrants and low-skilled workers who sneak into the United States. The Indian industry has time and again argued that it brings in highly skilled workers through the legal route who contribute significantly to the American industry and the American economy. Plus today, the Indian IT industry is not just a stealer of American jobs through outsourcing, but it also creates thousands of jobs in the United States for Americans through its massive investments in the American IT sector. Today, almost every Indian IT major has a strong presence in the United States, and through their investments and through their offices in the US, they have created numerous jobs for the Americans as well. So the editorial supports these arguments of the Indian IT industry, and it points out that these attacks of the Trump administration against skilled foreign workers is not really in the interest of protecting American jobs, but it is more focused upon protecting the core support base of Donald Trump in the run-up to the 2020 presidential elections in the US. The editorial argues that This conservative immigration policy of Donald Trump is driven by his desire to protect his core vote bank, which comprises of blue-collar workers, primarily from the middle and lower middle class families, and the conservative population, predominantly from the rural areas, whose livelihoods have been severely hit as a result of the downturn in the American economy and the exponential rise in unemployment as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Plus, such divisive topics also offers Donald Trump a distraction to cover up the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic by his administration. The editorial points out that the strength and the resilience of the American democracy and the American capitalist economy is drawn from the diversity of its population, its firm faith in liberal politics, and its openness and tolerance towards people of all faith, color, and nationality. This was the modern American dream that millions of people around the world aspired to achieve. But over the last 4 years, Donald Trump has driven the American society towards hate and polarization through his divisive politics and through his repeated attacks on religious minorities, racial minorities, and foreign migrant workers. His policies and speeches, which are usually divisive on the lines of religion, race, and nationality, has emerged as a grave challenge for every country that has a strong bilateral relationship with the United States. Even close allies of the United States, such as European countries, and even close strategic partners, such as India, have been at the receiving end of the impact of Trump's divisive politics that has gained momentum in the election year. So now, the challenge for the Indian government would be to protect the interests of the Indian IT industry, Indian professionals and students, without affecting its close strategic relationship with the US government. Now let's take up a couple of columns from page number 6 and page number 7, which deal with the 1-year anniversary of the revocation of Article 370. See, yesterday we looked at a few editorials and columns that largely took a pessimistic view of the revocation of Article 370. But the columns in today's newspaper, they provide a very different and a very fresh perspective. So first let us take up this column written by Amitabh Mattu. The writer is a scholar of international studies from the prestigious JNU, and he is one of the leading intellectuals from Kashmir. He says that Article 370 had lost much of its potency, and hence it was time for this provision to be revoked from the Indian Constitution. He says that through the revocation of Article 370, the Government of India achieved the constitutional integration of J&K with the Indian Union. But however, he points out that the government is still struggling to achieve the emotional integration of ordinary Kashmiris with the idea and concept of India. He says that if New Delhi wishes to achieve true emotional integration of the Kashmiris with the Indian Union, then it needs to reflect on its current strategies, and it needs to focus on winning the hearts and minds of the ordinary Kashmiri, and it can do this by revisiting the past and by drawing lessons from it. He refers to landmark events such as the 1965 war, the 1947 war, the 1971 conflict, and the Cold War, and he brings out individual acts of courage and bravery shown by ordinary Kashmiris, which is a symbolic reflection of Kashmir's long-standing belief in the concept of India. First, he refers to Operation Gulmarg, which was the code name given by the Pakistani army for its attempt at pushing tribal militias into Kashmir with the support of the Pakistani army in order to topple the Raja Hari Singh government. I hope you're aware that after the Indian Independence Act was passed, the Indian and the Pakistani dominion were set up, and the princely states were given the option to choose either of the dominions or to remain independent. The then monarch of the Jammu and Kashmir princely state, Raja Hari Singh, had chosen to remain independent, and with the intention of toppling his government and taking over the Jammu and Kashmir region, Pakistan sponsored the infiltration of tribal militias with the support of the Pakistani army, and this pushed Raja Hari Singh to sign the Instrument of Accession with India and integrate J&K with the Indian Union, and this became the trigger for the 1947 conflict between India and Pakistan. So the writer points out that during this invasion by Pakistani forces and the tribal militias, local Kashmiris offered resistance until the arrival of the Indian armed forces, and according to him, this highlighted the faith of the ordinary Kashmiri in the concept and the idea of India. It highlighted the rejection of Pakistan as a theological state by the ordinary Kashmiri and showed their belief in a secular and diverse India. Then he refers to Operation Gibraltar, which was the codename given by the Pakistani army for pushing infiltrators into the Kashmir Valley in order to trigger an uprising against the Indian government. He points out how alert Kashmiris in the border areas alerted the Indian army in time about the entry of these infiltrators, even at the grave risk to their own life and safety. It was this early intelligence provided by local Kashmiris which helped the Indian armed forces to tackle the Pakistani threat, and this is how Operation Gibraltar of Pakistan eventually led to the 1965 conflict between India and Pakistan. The writer points out that what pushed local Kashmiris to side with India during this conflict was their fundamental belief in the greatness and the goodness of the Indian civilization and the Indian constitution. That during the 1947 war, the Indian army managed to push back the Pakistani forces and it managed to retake a large part of Jammu and Kashmir. And then, in order to resolve the conflict, India took the matter to the United Nations. And through this mediation, a ceasefire agreement was worked out, and the UN mandated both India and Pakistan to hold a plebiscite in order to allow the people of Jammu and Kashmir to decide whether they want to join Pakistan or India or remain independent. Even though the ceasefire line was drawn up as mandated by the United Nations, both the countries failed to hold the plebiscite, and the blame for this lies with Pakistan. Because Pakistan started altering the demography of the occupied Kashmir region in order to ensure that if a plebiscite is ever held, the elections would swing in favor of Pakistan. See, a plebiscite is basically a form of direct elections which allows the people of a conflict-hit region to freely decide upon the sovereignty of the region. So the UN mandated plebiscite was supposed to give the option to the people of Jammu and Kashmir to decide whether they wanted to join Pakistan or India or remain independent. But due to Pakistan's attempts at subverting the plebiscite, India also decided to hold back on the conduct of the plebiscite. And as a result, during the Cold War, Western governments led by the United States and the United Kingdom, they started exerting diplomatic pressure on India to hold the promised plebiscite. In this context, the writer reminds us how the then Prime Minister Nehru leveraged Kashmir's soft power, that is Kashmiri art, in order to influence the visiting Soviet leadership for supporting India at the UN Security Council. Later, the Soviet Union would go on to vote against any Western resolution on the Kashmir issue brought up at the UN Security Council, and thus Soviet Union became a reliable friend for India at the United Nations Security Council. This, according to the writer, highlights the leverage of Kashmiri soft power, and it shows how deeply Kashmiri art is integrated into India's diversity. Then in 1971, after India achieved a decisive diplomatic and military victory during the liberation of Bangladesh war, a Kashmiri MP had remarked in the parliament that leaders have changed the course of history, but there are very few leaders who have changed geography itself. This was basically a reference by the Kashmiri MP to the role of Indira Gandhi in splitting Pakistan into two, which led to the birth of a new country, that is Bangladesh. This clearly shows that Kashmiri representatives were clearly in favor of the Indian Union, and they appreciated India's intervention in the liberation of Bangladesh. Then, as Pakistan-sponsored insurgency took over Kashmir from 1986 onwards, the writer points out the stellar role played by the Kashmiri police and its brave officers in successfully tackling insurgency and in neutralizing terror outfits such as the JKLF. According to the writer, this shows the faith of the Kashmir bureaucracy in the concept of India and their rejection of the concept of Pakistan. But however, the writer argues that this emotional connection that existed between Kashmir and India has been lost due to numerous mistakes that have been committed by the government of India. Today there is a sense of disconnect that has crept in, and hence the region cannot be truly integrated with the Indian Union by merely making few cosmetic changes to the constitution. So in order to achieve true integration, what we need is the emotional integration of the ordinary Kashmiris with the rest of India. So in this context, the writer is asking the government to focus on rebuilding these bonds by revisiting the past, and he is asking the government to make a beginning by opening direct talks and negotiations with the local stakeholders and immediately restore complete statehood to Jammu and Kashmir in order to protect the pride of the local people and win their hearts and minds. The next step would be the immediate conduct of elections that would pave the way for the formation of a new state government. And to enable this state government function efficiently, the writer is asking the government of India to provide greater autonomy and flexibility to the state administration and provide the right kind of incentives which will help in mainstreaming Kashmiris with the rest of India. Now let's look at a related column from page number 7, which provides the government's perspective on the revocation of Article 370. This column has been written by G. Kishan Reddy, the Minister of State in the Ministry of Home Affairs, and through this column, he provides the government's perspective on the revocation of Article 370 and the special status that was enjoyed by Jammu and Kashmir under Article 35A and as well as under Article 370. See, yesterday we had discussed that these special provisions allowed Jammu and Kashmir to have a separate constitution and a separate flag, and it also empowered the state government and the state legislature to decide upon the extension of central laws to Jammu and Kashmir, and it also allowed the state government and the state legislature to decide upon the permanent residency status, which would determine the employment rights, property rights and the voting rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So according to the writer, these special provisions had basically provided for a one country two system model, which earlier had been clearly rejected by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, the ideological figurehead of the BJP and the RSS. The Minister of State points out how Article 35A was discriminatory in nature and how it was taking away the employment rights, property rights and voting rights of a number of people. He gives examples to highlight how Article 35A was discriminatory against the daughters of permanent residents if they marry someone from outside the state who was a non-permanent resident. In such cases, the daughters won't be able to inherit the property, and hence, according to the writer, this was a violation of right to equality, which is a fundamental right under the Constitution. Similarly, the provisions of Article 35A and its definition of permanent residents was depriving a number of Indians from other states who were non-permanent residents and as well as refugees who had come in from West Pakistan during the partition from enjoying their employment, property and voting rights. The writer points out how Article 370 had created a constitutional anomaly. For example, if you look at Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which had criminalized homosexuality, it was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, and currently it has been removed from the Indian Penal Code. But despite this, Section 377 continued to exist in J&K because as per the special provisions of Article 370, the Indian Penal Code was not applicable in J&K and instead it was the Ranbir Penal Code. So even though the Supreme Court had struck down the constitutional validity of Section 377 of the IPC, the provision continued to remain in the Ranbir Penal Code, thereby creating a constitutional anomaly according to the writer. Similarly, the special provisions of Article 370 had prevented the extension of progressive legislations such as the Right to Education Act, the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, etc. The writer says that with the revocation of special status of J&K under Article 370, this discrimination under Article 35A and this constitutional anomaly has been brought to an end, and it has helped in realizing the dream of establishing a one nation, one constitution model. Then the writer even dismisses the objections that have been raised by the critics. Yesterday we discussed that the critics have pointed out that the revocation of Article 370 will increase violence and terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, and they have argued that it is going to affect India's international standing on the grounds of violation of fundamental rights and human rights. But the writer dismisses these objections and he says that Jammu and Kashmir has become all the more peaceful after the revocation of Article 370, and this internal decision of India has no external ramification. The Union Minister says that now the focus of the government is on promoting transformational development in J&K now that the barrier posed by Article 370 and Article 35A has been removed. He says that the government is focusing on counter-terror operations in order to neutralize the Pakistan-sponsored terror outfits. And while dealing with the national security challenge, he says that the government is equally focused upon socio-economic development as well. He says that the revocation of Article 370 will help in creating numerous opportunities not just for the people of Jammu and Kashmir but for the people of Ladakh as well. He points out how the government is focusing on Kashmir's agriculture and how it is looking to promote the interests of Kashmir's farmers by focusing on key crops from the region such as apples, walnuts, saffron, etc. He says that the center is planning to give a greater push to the National Saffron Mission because the Kashmiri saffron is a key spice which fetches a very high price both in the domestic market and as well as in the international market. And its value in the global market has gone up even higher after Kashmiri saffron acquired the GI tag. So he says that the government is looking at further promoting the National Saffron Mission, and it is also looking to promote ultra high density plantation of apples and walnuts in order to significantly increase the income of Kashmiri farmers. He even talks about the ambitious plans of the government to exploit the tourism potential of Jammu and Kashmir by providing for better connectivity in the region through the construction of new airports, railway lines, highways, etc. He says that the government is also focusing upon improving the healthcare infrastructure in Jammu and Kashmir, and the recent decision to establish 2 AIIMS institutions and 5 medical colleges is expected to help in this objective. He also says that now the people of Kashmir can enjoy the benefits of Ayushman Bharat, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was earlier not applicable as a result of the restrictions under Article 370. He says that the revocation of this special status has helped to completely integrate Kashmir's Panchayat Raj institutions with India's grassroots democracy, and he hopes that this transformational development that is likely to be seen in Jammu and Kashmir would help fulfill the Prime Minister's vision of Sabka Saath Sabka Vikas. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 that deals with the language policy that has been recommended by the National Education Policy. But we have already covered this topic in detail on the 30th of July and 31st of July. So I would request you to go back and watch this analysis. Now let's take up an article from page number 11, which brings out the observations of the United Nations, particularly the UNESCO, with regard to the disruption that has been caused to education as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The UN report points out that this has to be the biggest ever disruption caused to education across the world, because schools and colleges around the world have been closed as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns. The UN study estimates that around 24 million children are likely to drop out of the education system even after schools resume. The impact of the pandemic on livelihoods and family earnings is also likely to affect education finance, and a number of students from poor families and from poor countries may not be able to return to the schooling system. The study also points out the disproportionate impact of this disruption on the education of the girl child and the education of the weaker communities. The report points out that low-income countries are likely to see a higher dropout rate, and this is particularly concerning because education is of critical significance in low-income countries. Then even among students who manage to return to the schooling system, there is bound to be a significant learning loss caused by the closure of schools and colleges, and this estimate has been brought out through the Program for International Student Assessment, which is a worldwide study of education systems around the world carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are incorrect? Higher Education Financing Agency, or HEFA, has been established for providing interest-free loans to students below the poverty line for pursuing their higher education in top universities abroad. It is a joint venture of the Ministry of Human Resource Development and Canara Bank. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option A is the right answer, because the question is asking you to identify the incorrect statement. See, the Higher Education Financing Agency was recently established in order to provide financial assistance for the creation of educational infrastructure and R&D infrastructure in India's premier educational institutions such as IITs, NITs, etc. It basically provides timely finance at very low interest rates so that India's premier higher educational institutions can create high quality capital assets. This financing agency has been set up as a joint venture between the MHRD and a promoter bank, that is Canara Bank. Funding and grants would also be provided by channelizing CSR funds from the corporate sector and through charity and donations. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 2, the JNU shall be making use of funds obtained from the HEFA for creating new infrastructure at the university. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Namdapha Tiger Reserve is located near which international border? The correct answer is option C, Myanmar. See, the Namdapa Tiger Reserve is located in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. It is located very close to India's borders with Myanmar. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 4 which refers to Vijayanagar, which happens to be one of the remotest administrative circles in Arunachal Pradesh. The Vijayanagar region is located close to India-Myanmar border, and the region is densely forested, and it is located close to the Namdapa National Park. Now let's take up the next question. Which insurgency movement of the Northeast has its roots in the cyclic ecological phenomena known as Mautum? The correct answer is option B, insurgency in Mizoram. See, the Mizo insurgency is rooted in the famine that the region witnessed in 1959 and in the early 1960s. This famine was attributed to a cyclical ecological phenomena known as Mautum. This cyclical ecological phenomena occurs once in nearly 50 years, and it basically refers to the simultaneous flowering of bamboos. So this abundance of bamboo flowers produces a huge quantity of seeds which fall to the ground and become readily available as food for rodents such as rats. So the abundant availability of bamboo seeds on the ground results in an explosion in the rat population, and once these rats completely consume all the seeds, they turn their attention towards agricultural crops, which results in the occurrence of famine conditions and in the severe shortage of food. This cyclical ecological phenomena known as Mautum is usually seen in Mizoram, Manipur, and as well as in parts of Myanmar. So this severe famine seen in Mizoram in the late 1950s and early 1960s led to severe shortage of food and as well as a number of deaths, and the local Mizo tribe was severely affected, and they blamed the government neglect for this. So this led the Mizos to hold disaffection against the government of India and the local administration, and this laid the foundation for the formation of the Mizo National Front, which took up armed insurgency against the government of India. This violent insurgent movement was a separatist movement which was seeking to liberate Mizoram from the Indian Union, and it remained very active for nearly 2 decades. Finally, in 1986, through effective counter-insurgency operations and through negotiations, the MNF was brought to the negotiating table by the government of India, and the historic Mizo Peace Accord was signed, which today has brought the Mizo National Front to mainstream politics. In fact, Mizoram happens to be one of the first states in the northeast of India where insurgency was brought to an end back in the 1980s itself. This question has been asked because the 50 years ago article from page number 7 makes a reference to Mizo insurgency and how the Mizo National Front was being sponsored by China and as well as by Pakistan by making use of terror safe havens which were established in East Pakistan. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? COVAX facility is a mechanism designed to guarantee rapid, fair and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines around the world. It is a global collaboration led by the World Health Organization, Gavi, or the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization, and includes governments, global health organizations, civil society groups, businesses and philanthropies. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 8, the chief scientist of the World Health Organization, Soumya Swaminathan, has stated that under the COVAX facility, the COVID-19 vaccine is likely to become available around the world by mid-2021. That is, if the ongoing vaccine trials succeed and establish the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Islamic State in the Khorasan province, or ISIS-K, is an affiliate branch of the Islamic State in northern Africa. In Afghanistan, ISIS is seen as an ideological ally of the Taliban. Both ISIS and Taliban are seen as a threat to Indian interests in Afghanistan. See, amongst the given statements, the first 2 statements are incorrect, so option C is the correct answer. This question was asked because we have 2 related articles on page number 1 and 11. Now let's take up the next question. The terms call for action and other monitored jurisdictions are associated with which international organization? The correct answer is option B, FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force. See, call for action is basically a reference to the FATF's blacklist, and other monitored jurisdictions is basically a reference to FATF's grey list. Now let's take up the next question. Which amongst the given Indian princely state stated its desire to join the Pakistan Dominion after the enactment of the Indian Independence Act? The correct answer is option C, Junagadh. Now let's take up the next question. Ibrahim Al-Qazi is a noted personality known for his contributions to the field of theatre. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because the article on page number 16 makes a reference to the passing away of Ibrahim Al-Qazi. See, Ibrahim Al-Qazi is a legendary theatre personality of India, and he has been the longest serving director of the National School of Drama. He has directed popular plays such as Girish Karnad's Tughlaq, Dharamveer Bharti's Andhayug, and he has also personally mentored a number of popular actors including Nasiruddin Shah, Om Puri, etc. So his passing away is a great loss for Indian theatre, and even Prime Minister Modi has mourned his death. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. Which one of the following is the best description of the term ecosystem? See, ecosystem involves the interaction between biotic components and as well as the abiotic components. The biotic components refers to the flora and fauna, and an ecosystem not only includes interactions amongst the living organisms, but it also includes their interactions with the abiotic world, that is their environment. So the best description amongst the given options would be option C. Ecosystem is a community of organisms together with the environment in which they live. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, evaluate the impact of conservative immigration policies of the US on Indian interests. The second question, the government views the removal of Article 370 as a key vehicle to usher in transformational development in Jammu and Kashmir. Comment. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.